This is the Apologist Bookshelf, and I'm Gary Zacharias. I'm here to take a third look, pulling the same book off the shelf for the third time. It's called Talking with Your Kids About God, subtitled 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. Natasha Crain is the author, and she's got so many good books out now. She's got a great blog. You might want to take a look at that one. And so she's got one previous book that's really good, too, called Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. And so she has other books that are super. They're really, really good. She's clear. She's thoughtful and does an excellent job coming from a parent's perspective to talk about difficult issues with our kids. So I wanted to do, the first section of her book is about the existence of God. And she's got a chapter here that says, what's the difference between God and a flying spaghetti monster? She says, well, it's not just a random fictional creature. So it came about in 2005. There was a guy who wrote a satirical letter to the Kansas State Board of Education. He didn't want them to allow intelligent design to be taught as an alternative to education, to evolution in public schools. So he said, well, what's the difference? Might as well talk about a flying spaghetti monster that created the universe. Ha ha. You know, a silly set of beliefs and no proof for it at all. Isn't that funny? Ha ha. And it says it's taken on a broader identity in popular culture. Now it symbolizes the idea that there's no evidence at all for God's existence. And so it's just as stupid to believe in God as it is to believe in a flying spaghetti monster. So she says, all right, second section of her opening part here is no evidence for God or a flying spaghetti monster, ? She said, please keep in mind, evidence itself doesn't say anything. It's kind of like the story, science doesn't say anything, scientists say things. So she said, same thing here, evidence itself doesn't say anything. People have to interpret the evidence. So she says, when people say, well, there's evidence for something or against something, she said what they're really saying is that there's evidence that people are interpreting as being for or against something. So she says, what if there's no evidence at all to interpret? And that's the case of the flying spaghetti monster. So she gives a really good illustration here. She said, imagine I'm at your house, and I tell you and a friend that I may or may not have put something in the closed room next to you. There are no clues to help you determine what's there. So let's say I put a dog in the room, and your friend says, did you put a toy? Did you put a necklace? I could have put, she says, anything in the room, millions of things. And it says that is kind of ridiculous. You'd have no evidence at all. It's foolish. It says we don't want to devote our lives to a belief that there's a toy in there or whatever when there's no reason to do so. But she says, what if there is some kind of evidence? So it says, let's say I put something in your room and I tell you that. And before you guess, you investigate. You start looking around. You see some dog hair nearby, but you don't have a dog. Then you notice what looks like paw prints just inside your front door. And then you hear some sounds coming from within that room, some scratching and maybe some whining. And so you tell your friend, I think there's a dog in the room. And you explained your reasoning. And so it said, in many ways, this discussion ends up being some of what we hear when debate occurs between theists and atheists. Theists say the origin of the universe and the origin and development of life and our moral understanding. Those things are best explained by the existence of a creating, designing, and moral law-giving being we call God. Atheists say, no, none of those things have to do with God. There's some kind of unknown natural mechanism, in the case of the origin of the universe, or it's evolutionary theory that gives us life here and moral understanding. So she said, look, atheists and theists are looking at and trying to explain the same set of facts about the universe. Now, so there's not a case of no evidence, just blindly guessing that God exists. Theists are looking at a set of facts about the universe. There are facts out there, and they're asserting that the evidence points toward the existence of God. Now, atheists can make their own assertions about those facts, but it's not fair, she says, to claim that theists aren't basing their beliefs on any evidence at all. So she said, what does it mean when atheists say there's no evidence? It means they don't think that the facts of the universe, as you lay them out, they don't think those facts are best explained by the existence of a deity. She said this is so important for kids to understand. It's the difference between them thinking that their belief in God is completely untethered to any kind of evidence, and understanding that there are important facts about the universe that atheists and theists explain differently. So there is evidence to consider. That's her point here. And then we look at that evidence, and I guess you'd say we put it through our worldview, and we come to different conclusions. But she says our kids would be better prepared to engage with the claims of the secular world if we see things that way. So she said, by the way, let's not miss the fact that the existence of a flying spaghetti monster would explain nothing. There's no evidence at all about, she says, airborne wheat. And she said, William Lane Craig, a well-known Christian philosopher, said this: the real lesson to be learned from the case of the flying spaghetti monster is it shows how completely out of touch our popular culture is with the great tradition of theology, natural theology. That people could think that belief in God is anything like the groundless belief in a fantasy monster shows how ignorant they are of the works of famous philosophers, both past and present. Given the revival of natural theology in our day, he says, over the last half-century, we have no excuse for such lame caricatures of theistic belief as belief in the flying spaghetti monster. So at the end of the chapter, then, she has key points, which she sums up. So here they are. This flying spaghetti monster symbolizes the idea there's no evidence of God, and that therefore you're being ridiculous if you think there is a God. She says, secondly, theists are not blindly guessing that God exists. They are looking at facts, and they're asserting the best explanation for those facts is the existence of God. Now, she says, thirdly, atheists look at that same set of facts, and they assert that there are better natural explanations. So her point, last point, atheists and theists can legitimately disagree over the interpretation, but it's wrong for atheists to claim theists aren't basing their beliefs on any evidence at all. See, I think that's really a good point. And then at the end of the chapter, she has what she calls conversation guide, and this is so useful. And she asks some of the questions about the flying spaghetti monster, and she, at the end, she has a quote from Richard Dawkins, and Dawkins says, I think this is worth quoting here. In his book, The God Delusion, atheist Richard Dawkins says, I found it an amusing strategy when asked whether I'm an atheist to point out that the questioner is also an atheist when considering other gods like Zeus, Apollo, Amun-Ra, Mithras, Baal, Thor, Wotan, the golden calf, and the flying spaghetti monster. I just go one god further. Now her question then, why do you think Dawkins is comparing God to these fictional deities? How would you respond to his comparison? So those are good thinking questions that she has at the end of that chapter. Now, I've got enough time. If that's okay, I'd like to do the very next chapter. This is chapter 6 in her book. Again, the title is Talking with Your Kids About God. How much evidence do we need to be confident God exists? Now, that's an interesting question. She mentions Ratio Christi, a really good organization. I love that organization. It's an apologetics group that goes onto college campuses and sets up student groups there. But the president of Ratio Christi, the founder and director at Ohio State, says in all the years that he's dealt with students, skeptical students, he said one objection comes up more than any other. Are you ready for it? Now, I thought it would be like the problem of evil. No, here it is. Why won't God show me a direct sign that he exists? So do you see what the students are saying? There is evidence out there, but they're saying it's not enough. And she said, there was a student that he interviewed, Shabbat interviewed this student. What would be compelling reasons to believe the God of the Bible exists? And this person says, I would have to say unambiguous direct evidence. Some people will use their explanation for God existing as things we don't know, like the evidence that everything's so fine-tuned, but that doesn't do much for me. I would prefer to have actual direct evidence of somebody saying, this directly points to God himself coming down and speaking. And at that point, I'd have to verify with someone that I'm not hallucinating. It has to be some direct evidence of God, not an extrapolation of evidence from something else. So she says, that's not a new complaint. People have always wanted more evidence. And she gives an example. Bertrand Russell, pretty famous atheist philosopher. Somebody once asked him, what if he ends up standing before God, and God asks him why he didn't believe? Russell said he would reply, Sir, why did you not give me better evidence? So, she says, let's talk about this common challenge. She said, we need to start with an important fact. The kind of evidence that we would like to have doesn't have any bearing on the best evidence for the best explanation for the evidence that we do have. Right? So, yeah, would you prefer more evidence? Well, I said, what about this? The detectives, they work crimes all the time. Said, very rarely do you find a note left by somebody that says, I, John Doe, did it. You can reach me at, and then there's a phone number. Would detectives like that kind of evidence? Yeah. But they don't get it like that, do they? 99 times out of 100, she says, do they just throw their hands in the air and say, well, I can't believe anybody did it? No. They understand the question is not what evidence they wish they had, but what's the best way to explain the evidence that they do have? So she said the same thing. She said, we could sit around and debate what we wish God would have given us, but that's neither here nor there. We have to draw conclusions about what we see, what's there. And so she says, then we're back to the question, is the evidence out there enough for us to be confident that God exists? Well, she said, then there's that word enough. What might be enough for one person to believe in God might not be enough for somebody else. That's pretty, what would you call it, subjective, isn't it? One atheist blogger said, here's enough. If I saw an unambiguous message from God, I'd be persuaded of his existence. If I saw writing suddenly appear in the sky in letters 100 feet high saying, I am God, I exist, here's what I want you to do. And if that writing were seen by every human being, written in whatever language they understood, comprehended in the same way by everyone who saw it, I would be persuaded that God existed. Well, that's interesting. It said, if she applied, that blogger had applied a similar criterion to anything else in life, she really wouldn't be able to say much about what she knew. I mean, she wants undeniable evidence, but she said, do we have undeniable evidence that George Washington existed? That's a pretty inconsistent standard of proof. It says, even if we don't have such certain evidence, why wouldn't a perfectly loving and good God make the fact of his existence undeniable? That's a good question. She says the answer to that is God wants us to use our free will to seek him. What does she mean? Well, you need some amount of free will to genuinely love God. Otherwise, if we saw those letters in the sky, we'd have to bow, we'd have to snap a salute. We'd be like robots. Our affections would be forced, and a forced love is no love at all. So if God reveals himself completely, he would remove our freedom to seek and love him. She quotes Blaise Pascal, a 17th century Christian philosopher. Willing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart, God so regulates the knowledge of himself that he has given indications of himself which are visible to those who seek him and not to those who do not seek him. There is enough light for those to see who only desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition. I think that's a really interesting way to put that. There's evidence, but we have to want it, we have to search for it, we have to do a little bit of work, don't we? She said many atheists claim they need undeniable evidence, but she said there is good reason to believe God wouldn't give us that evidence, because it would turn us into robots. She says, all right, so we're back to the question, do we have enough evidence to at least be confident? Not overwhelming total proof, but to say we are confident God exists. And at the same kind of level, it would make us confident of a lot of other beliefs we hold. So she recaps what she's talked about up until now in the book. So she said, do we have some evidence? Okay, how about this? The universe. We have a universe that began to exist. Well, then that means it had to be a cause beyond itself and had to create everything in the universe. That means that cause is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Doesn't that start to sound like God? How about this? Number 2, we have the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, she's covered these in previous chapters, by the way. The universe appears to be finely tuned for life, both in the constants of nature and the parameters of our Earth and our solar system. It looks like the Earth has been designed. Then there's the origin of life. It says chance doesn't seem to be an adequate explanation for biological complexity and specificity that we see. You look at how intricate living things are. It's good reason to believe they're the product of intelligence. Number 4, she says, we have an understanding that there is objective morality. We have a near universal sense that certain things are right and wrong. regardless of personal opinion. So if there are objective moral laws, it's reasonable to conclude they come from a moral lawgiver. Yeah, that makes sense. Now she says, of course, any one of those may not be compelling enough for a person to say, I don't know, I don't think I'm confident to believe in a God. But she says, it's the collective evidence that all point in the same direction that makes the case for God so powerful. I agree. So it's the cumulative case that you're doing. I mention that sometimes when I'm giving a talk. I say, maybe one of these doesn't work for you, or you don't think it's strong, or maybe it's two of them. But if I give you 10 pieces of proofs, 10 pieces of evidence, that's good news, isn't it? I mean, think about it. If you're in a courtroom situation, you're the prosecutor, you only have one piece of evidence against the accused, you may not get the verdict that goes your way. But what if you had 10 or 15 or 20 pieces of evidence? That's starting to make you feel a lot more confident. So she mentions J. Warner Wallace here. What a neat guy, super guy. So in the book that he wrote, God's Crime Scene, he explains as an atheist that he just couldn't ignore where all this cumulative evidence was pointing. So here's a quote from J. Warner Wallace. As an atheist, I was very comfortable as the captain of my own ship. I'm not a theist today because I was raised by believers. I wasn't. I'm not a believer because I was hoping for heaven or afraid of hell. I had no sense of value for either. I'm not a theist because I was trying to fill a void in my life or satisfy a need. I felt none. I believe God exists because the evidence leaves me no reasonable alternative. The evidence points to a very specific suspect, right? Because he's a cold case detective. So could people come up with other explanations for all that evidence? Sure, she said that. But the number of possible explanations doesn't have anything to do with which explanation is best. Now, we have multiple pieces of evidence, she says, that can all be explained by the same suspect, God. And she says, even if we don't have evidence enough for certainty, we have enough for confidence. And she, again, the end of the chapter, she hits her key points. The evidence, she said, that we would like to have doesn't have any bearing on the best explanation for the evidence that we do have. Number two, she says, the best question to ask is the amount of evidence that we do have. Is that enough for us to be confident that God exists? Third, while many people answer no to that question unless they have certainty, she said there are reasons to believe God would not want to reveal himself in such an undeniable way because he'd remove our freedom to seek and to love him. So, back to the question, do we have enough evidence to be confident that he exists? She says, absolutely. And one more time, remember her list. The universe is here, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, and our understanding of objective morality. She said those all add up to good evidence, good solid evidence. And then she has the conversation guide, and I like the opening part of her conversation. If you could pick any way for God to make himself more known to you, what would you pick? Why? Yeah, those are good questions. And then she has some things from the chapter. Since God hasn't revealed himself in the way you just described, does that make you doubt his existence? Why or why not? So she's got some comments there, questions to consider, with parentheses with where to go with your reaction to the statements that the people make as you're talking to them, your kids. And then at the end, she calls apply the conversation. She said, read the quote from the interview of that agnostic student at the beginning of the chapter. How would you respond to what he said? If you could have a conversation with him, what are some questions you would ask him to better understand what he believes and why he believes it? So remember, he's the one that said, what kind of evidence you want? He said, well, I have to say unambiguous direct evidence. So he was a little vague about that. But do you see how nice this book is as far as it gives you information and it gives you things that you can talk about in maybe a dinner conversation with your kids? And so I like this because it's not just giving the adult information, it's giving adult information, and then how does the adult work with the young person and to make the young person understand what's being said here. So again, the book is called Talking with Your Kids About God, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. I would say this is a really important book. And if you don't have kids, it's still really good information in here when you're talking with friends. Maybe you got grandkids. Good ways to get conversations going with them too. Well, anyway, thank you for being part of this podcast, and we'll do another one soon.